Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're ready to have our final speaker. And as you can see from our program, our next speaker has accomplished much in many places. Much too much for me to cover now. But to me, our speaker is the person who unveiled the plaque of Mary Shelley in Bath. And to him, I'm very grateful that he was part of that wonderful evening. And following the unveiling, he spoke most passionately about the merits of Mary Shelley and her now famous novel. Today, he has a more personal story to tell of his association with Angela Carter and his appreciation of her work. I'm delighted he could join us today and has agreed to give this concluding talk of our one-day symposium on Bath's Gothic fiction. Could we welcome Sir Christopher Frayling?
Thank you very much indeed for that. It's extraordinary how things come together. You know, the word serendipity was invented by Horace Walpole, who wrote the first Gothic novel. There's one nice connection, and the plaque has come up, and Mary Shelley and Angela occasionally, and so on. So it's rather nice that things are coming together. My talk, which is based on a book I wrote called Inside the Bloody Chamber, takes the form of a series of verbal snapshots about my close literary friendship with Angela Carter in the 1970s, and about the time she spent living in Bath between 1972 and 1976. She arrived in Bath in 1972 after her 1 year, 3-day stint in Japan. Hang on, I can't find the clicker. Here it is, yes. And she stayed until 1976, with many return visits until 1979. She wrote her provocative books, The Sardian Woman and The Great Hermaphrodite, later called The Passion of New Eve. She published her translation of Perrault's fairy tales and Comic and Curious Cats. She revised her short stories for the collection Fireworks. She contributed her regular Arts in Society column to New Society, which was a weekly journal, 12 articles in 1976 alone. She wrote articles for the Radio Times and the New Statesman. She translated Xavier Gautier's study of surrealism and sexuality. And above all, it was a time when she concocted her classic collection, The Bloody Chamber, and adapted 2 of the stories in it for radio. While she was in Bath, she started with The Lady of the House of Love, the first story in the collection that she wrote, a vampire story, of which more a bit later. She wrote The Ill King and The Company of Wolves, and then she got a creative writing fellowship at Sheffield, which started in October 1976, during which she developed the rest of the stories. She only wrote 2 more novels after she left for London in the next 13 years, Nights at the Circus in 1984, partly based on her Bath notebooks, and Wise Children a lot later in 1991. Since her death in February 1992 at the age of 51, Angela's reputation as a writer and a thinker has soared to the point where The Bloody Chamber is now, as we know, a school's examination set text in this country. It's taught on many university literature courses and women's studies courses worldwide. And there are even MA programs almost entirely devoted to her writings, Carter Studies, which would have amused her mightily. Her complete works have been reprinted, or almost complete works. There's still 1 or 2 things that need reprinting. Her complete works have been reprinted several times in the last 30 years since her death. And films such as The Company of Wolves, 1984, and The Magic Toy Shop, 1987, and plays such as Nights at the Circus, put on by Knee High in 2006, and Wise Children, which was put on at the Bristol Old Vic, have been derived from them. But above all, I think, where today's theme is concerned, her influence on the contemporary Gothic and on current readings of fairy tales and filmed versions of them, and on feminist literature of the magical realist kind, has been profound. She's been constructed as a sort of fairy godmother of contemporary Gothic, a kind of earth mother figure. And sometimes, I think it has to be said, as a plaster saint, which she would have resented. And yet, the rich period when she was here in Bath has tended to be written out of the story, or at least sidelined. It's been assumed by the literati who review each other that it was only when she arrived on the London literary scene in the late 1970s that she found her voice and was recognised. Now, the latter may well be true, the being recognised bit, but the former certainly isn't. Even the recent biography of Angela by Edmund Gordon tends to treat the Bath years as a kind of retreat, a cocoon, and concludes she needed to be closer to the action. And Marina Warner once said to me, "You knew Angela Carter before she was Angela Carter." And I actually don't think that's true. So I wanted, in addition to talking about my friendship with Angela, to set the record straight today. There's been quite a lot of research into her Bristol years. Some people in the room are responsible for it. When she lived at Royal York Crescent, BA at Bristol University in English, especially Middle English, 1962 to 1965, followed by her Bristol, so-called Bristol trilogy of novels, Honey Buzzard or Shadow Dance, 1966, Several Perceptions, 1968, and Love, 1967. And they've been studied. In fact, they're the subject of the book. But the Bath years really haven't had the equivalent amount of attention. And one of the reasons, I think, of course, is that Bath University doesn't do literature. I mean, you've got UWE and Bristol, a home team batting for Angela in Bristol. We don't have such a home team in Bath, and I think that's a shame. Angela herself, Bath years, it was like shouting in an empty room. So while I was researching my memoir, Inside the Body Chamber, I spent a lot of time in the British Library, where she bequeathed 2 long sets of notebooks, which date from the early 1960s right through to when she was diagnosed with lung cancer. And they're in 2 sets. One are personal reminiscences and reflections, and they're the odd numbers, and working notes on work in progress and quotations that she's picked up during the course of the day or through her readings, even numbers. And the personal reflections, the odd numbers volume, it really was very, very strange reading them, because conversations that I'd had with Angela in the daytime were transcribed. Actually, they were Gothicized quite a lot, because her imagination ran riot sometimes. But the conversations were there, and it was like eavesdropping on my own life. It was I've never had that experience in any other way, reading through her book, her notebooks on conversations. For example, I remember we went to the Bristol Hippodrome, which she insisted on calling the Hippo, and off we went to see The Marriage of Figaro. And we spent the whole journey back discussing what social class Cherubino might be, because Cherubino is Count Almaviva's page, and in the first act gets sent off into the army and seems to be very much at home in the aristocratic environment. But at the end of Act 3, he's palmed off on a peasant girl called Barbarina, and nobody seems to bat an eyelid. So where does he belong in the class system? We were agonising in this long journey. And I remember this discussion, and then I read the notebooks, and there it is, the whole discussion about Almaviva in the notebooks. But more than that, it also comes up with a talking tiger in Nights at the Circus, where the tiger talks about what social class Almaviva is. So she didn't waste much material. It's a very strange experience. Anyway, one of the things we used to do was go around the bronze plaques of Bath. Much has been said of these today, so I don't want to repeat too much. But we all knew that they're scrolls attached to Georgian buildings, like solid pieces of formal parchment. And the idea for the plaques really emerged in the 1890s and in the Edwardian era. And 45 of them were put up in 1898. And we were all reading in the early 70s Michel Foucault's book, The Archaeology of Knowledge, which is all about how the archive is created. It tells you an awful lot about the hidden assumptions of a particular period. You know, don't necessarily believe what's on the page. And so we were looking at these plaques for the philosophy of history that it contained in late Victorian and Edwardian times. So, of course, Jane Austen, synonymous with Bath. And I'm afraid, sorry to offend everybody, but Angela once said in a seminar at Bath University that Jane Austen was a provincial lady who probably knew little or nothing about the actual mechanics of sexual intercourse and was a great deal more interested in table manners. Or Henry Fielding with Sarah in Widcombe, or Charles Dickens, who sort of slept here, but he got in, Sir Walter Scott, and as we've learned, all chaps, with one or two, I think there were 4 exceptions in Edwardian times, four plays to women in Bath, or Thomas Gainsborough in the Circus, or Priam Bindia, or William Pitt, and so on. One of them, which intrigued Angela, was John Christopher Smith in 18 Brock Street, because, you know, there were all sorts of very famous women from history who didn't get in, but John Christopher Smith did get in, and what Angela said was, what it should really have said was, here dwells John Christopher Smith, sycophantic arse liquor, or rather, as she preferred to call it, practitioner of anal lavage. And why, she asked, wasn't there something to Thomas de Quincey, who after all grew up in number 6 Green Park, and I know that relates to this morning's talk as well. Why doesn't Thomas de Quincey get a plaque in Green Park? Because Bath was actually very important to him. And why didn't John Wilkes get a plaque in South Parade, 6 doors down from where Walter Scott lived, although they didn't live there at the same time? In other words, a kind of censorship had gone on in the choice of plaques, and a particular philosophy of history, male, to do with very much to do with public life, the canon, all the things that we talk about now, and that really fascinated her. So, as we've heard, I wrote a letter on illegally, actually, on Bath University headed note paper to Bath City Council with Angela's blessing, suggesting that they commission a metal plaque, which I thought should say Frankenstein was created here. Which is wrong, but, well, it was a kind of joke, but of course it isn't Frankenstein's created, the creature that's created. No, it sort of compounded that confusion. Anyway, on the site of what used to be Five Abbey Churchyard. In the event, as we've heard, the City Council remained unconvinced. They wrote back saying there had been several requests in the past to put up a plaque on that same site to Percy Shelley, which they had turned down, and Mary Shelley, to their mind, had less of a claim than her husband. In any case, they added with an exclamation mark, hadn't Frankenstein more to do with Hollywood than Bath? Quote, the book of the film, as it were. A flag would surely lower the tone in the city of Monash and Jane Austen. We get many requests in that nature, etc., and I'm sure you will understand yours sincerely. And what was marvellous about the great unveiling that we just heard about was that, I mean, possibly it's the speed of light in Bath, about 40 years to make the right decision, but eventually it was taken. Now, looking back, this of course it relates to Mary. This is Victorian. Before the pump room was remodelled, so on the left by the circulating library was where Mary Shelley had her lodgings. And one of the attractions, as we heard, was lots of books. And there it is today. Looking back, the exchange of letters with Bath City Council was, of course, about much more than just a bronze flag. It was about the critical respectability of Jane Austen and Henry Fielding and Walter Scott, and in the mid-1970s, the continuing unrespectability of Gothic novels and stories, and the many guilty pleasures to be had from them. Gothic novels were not quite pucker. They were too stagey, they used too many adjectives, they were not to be taken seriously. They held up a curious haunted mirror to the true-to-life mainstream of English literature. F.R. Leibus's great tradition, which Angela always referred to as the eat your broccoli tradition of teaching English. And as for their authors, they certainly didn't qualify for entry into England's almost all-male cricket 11. The exceptions being George Eliot and Jane Austen. Mary Shelley, forget it. One of Angela's favourite lines at the time was from the Marquis de Sade, quote, art is the perfect immoral subversion of the established order. Art, including fairy tales, and especially Gothic fiction. And so I wrote this letter, and Angela encouraged me to write it for other reasons as well. Partly because there were too many plaques devoted to the chaps, as you like to call them, because science fiction, fantasy, Gothic literature, and fairy tales were looked down upon, patronised, and put in a separate box marked cult by the literary establishment, left out of conventional rankings and listings, when, as she said, writers in the early 70s, such as J.G. Ballard, Michael Moorcock, Brian Aldiss, and Christopher Priest, were among the best practitioners there were of the novel of ideas, of arguments stated in fictional terms. And because she wanted to stick up two fingers to the F.R. Leavis school and the whole Eat Your Broccoli school of literary criticism, which she had been force-fed on at Bristol University. And because Mary Shelley had been sidelined by her husband through the condescension of posterity. So for all those reasons, we wrote, and we were very disappointed with the result. Number 5, Hay Hill, where she lived, she moved there in 1973. Between 72 and 73, she lived with a friend who now taught at Bath University in Sydney Place, and then moved to number 5 Hay Hill in 73. And as you may know, Hay Hill is a kind of hyphen between Lansdowne Road and the Circus at the top end, and past the Baptist Church to George Street and over the road to Walcott, gateway to alternative Bath at the bottom end. It was a kind of hyphen that she wrote about in 2 articles in the New Society and spoke about often, between the alternative Bath and established Bath. On the one hand, the Bath of the presence of famous historical characters, or some of them, a city built for pleasure at the high point of an architectural style, a monument to the taste of a certain class, which, as she wrote, later became institutionalized as good taste. A bad place to feel sad in, built as it was for the headlong pursuit of pleasure, which, as she said, accounts for its ineradicable melancholy. Like Monte Carlo or Las Vegas, out of season and with real stone columns. On the other hand, there was subterranean Bath, a place of dishevelled loveliness, she said, some of it half pulled down, where dwelt, and I quote, occultists, Neoplatonists, yogis, theosophists, little old ladies who have spirit conversations with Red Indian squaws, religious maniacs, senile dements, natural lifers, macrobiotics, people who make perfume candles, kite flyers, and do you believe in fairies? She liked to say that there were a lot of follies in Bath, and only a few of them were architectural ones. Most of them were made of flesh and blood. Nutters had been coming to Bath in their drove since Regency times to take the waters and gamble away their patrimonies. By the way, the little old ladies and Indian squaws came from the film Night of the Demon rather than real life, as some of you may recognise. But those nice psychical research people did have an office at the end of Pulteney Street, which we once visited together. It's now a solicitor's office. Hay Hill. I arrived in Bath in October 1973, a fresh-faced lecturer at the university in the history of ideas. I was 26 and Angela was 33. I just completed my Cambridge doctorate on Jean-Jacques Rousseau's novel, written in epistolary form, found documents again, Julie ou la Nouvelle Héloïse, a runaway bestseller in 18th century Europe, and how it was this, rather than his more overtly political works, The Social Contract or The Discourse on Inequality, was the way in which most readers encountered Rousseau's ideas, including Robespierre, actually. The thesis was also about the writers who had replied to Rousseau's novel, including Laclos, with Les Liaisons Dangereuses, which is why he wrote it, and which took the same epigraph as La Nouvelle Héloïse. I have seen the manners of my time, and I have published these letters, only to make it sound much more cynical. And the Marquis de Sade, with Justine, or the Misfortunes of Virtue, about Justine and her sister Juliette, and La Nouvelle Justine, the titles deliberately echoing Rousseau's, which argued that innocence just gets you into trouble in a nasty world, and that being a victim is of no use at all. The point was to make a world of yourself. De Sade had a copy of La Nouvelle Héloïse with him in the asylum at Charenton, where he was imprisoned for something they called sexual dementia in 1803. And Mary Wollstonecraft courted William Godwin with a copy of the same book. I also arrived with a half-finished book on the vampire theme in 19th century. This has been embarrassing, this photo. It's me with a bat. I also arrived with a half-finished book on the vampire theme in 19th century literature and a suitcase full of books and Xeroxes on the subject, an interest which arose for me from the reactions of the philosophers of the Enlightenment to an apparent epidemic of vampirism which had broken out in Eastern Europe and Greece in the 1730s, and which started the whole vampire craze in modern literature. I bring up with Hammer films, a taste that I shared with Angela. And we had a lot to talk about. We went to the opera a lot. We went to the Magic Flute at the Hippo. Angela wrote in her journal, The Queen of the Night's Sermon, and to Verdi's Falstaff, after which we fantasized about Falstaff as a liberal education for Prince Hal, the University of the Boar's Head Tavern. And what if Prince Charles had had Falstaff to initiate him? And what if Henry V had said to the fat old man at his coronation, let's have some changes around here, instead of, I know thee not, old man. It was quite a fact again in the notebooks. We went to Weber's 1821 opera, The Freishutz, The Marksman, with its famous scene in the Wolf's Glen, and talked about transposing it to the Wild West as a kind of satanic western, in which the seventh bullet in a magic six-shooter would belong to the devil, and there would be a climactic gunfight in a graveyard like in The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, which we also saw, as well as Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, which she liked a lot for its strangely anarchic vision of the borderland and assorted Italian westerns. The satanic western out of the Freishutz eventually turned into Angela's TV script, Gun for the Devil, which has in fact been published, which she wrote in 1975. And there was The Flying Dutchman, and Angela's beautiful vampire countess in The Lady of the House of Love would soon believe herself to be living out the myth with roles reversed, that she might be made whole by human feeling with a kiss. And we talked a lot about rather esoteric books about vampires, which I brought with me, which she annotated copiously. She loved this idea. Do you remember there were a series of good food guides by a man called Rone? And she said for some reason she thought this book was going to be a good food guide for vampires, but it's not the same Rone, but she rather liked the idea. And there were quite a lot of publications happening in the 70s on the subject, which, and this went back to 1928, the classic book, The Vampires, Kith and Kin, by the eccentric Montague Summers, who used to appear at the reading room with a huge black briefcase and the word vampires written in red on them, just so that everyone knew what he was researching. And in spring of 1974, shortly after Angela had returned through the Soviet Union on the Trans-Siberian Railway from Japan in February for another brief visit to Japan, Angela and I went to see F.W. Murnau's 1922 silent film, Nosferatu. It wasn't a particularly good quality print. It wasn't tinted, so you couldn't tell which scenes took place at night and which took place in the daytime. Nighttime should have been tinted blue, but the film did include one of the most beautiful intertitles of the whole silent era. It comes when the young hero, Hutter, or Jonathan Harker, is first met by the coach and horses from Castle Dracula. And the title goes, and when he crossed over the bridge, the phantoms came to meet him. Angela wrote this phrase twice in her private journal and included it verbatim in her radio play Vampirella. It was her first ever reference to vampires. And one thing that intrigued us was that it was also the mantra of Parisian surrealists in the 1920s. André Breton went to see Nosferatu in 1926 and wrote in his journal that this phrase instilled terror and delight in him, and his friends used to go and see it and intone this phrase as a mantra whenever the intertitle came up. And when he crossed over the bridge, the phantoms came to meet him. There's a kind of summary of what surrealism is trying to do, a gateway into a world of fantasies and imagination, stepping out of the bridge into the world of phantoms. So this phrase really meant a lot to both of us. At that stage, The Lady of the House of Love was to have been used for a short story set in Japan after her 1974 visit, The Lady of the House of Love and the Gangster of Good Fortune. Later, it would become the title of her vampire story, adapted from the radio play Vampirella. And I can remember clearly our conversations about Nosferatu. Angela borrowed my copy of the script as well as the books that I've shown, all of which she copiously annotated. She wrote in her journal, and when he crossed over the bridge, the phantoms came to meet him. The master is coming, do not dare to speak his name. And later, Nosferatu with his coffin on his shoulder, his fingers like roots, tuberous fingers, the head is like a phallus with one eye blacked out. Nosferatu at the window of his mansion, Nina, it's the Nina Harker figure, Nina and hers. Nosferatu is bent over Nina's body like a pieta, parody of a wedding night, a night-sized hallucination, a figure inscribed in the corner of sleep. And Angela, in fact, made a line drawing of Nosferatu's face based on this in her journal to illustrate what she called a penis with teeth. And she had a film still of the Count standing on the deck of his coffin ship, cut out and interleaved in her journal. Our viewing of Nosferatu and the many conversations we subsequently had stimulated Angela's growing interest in vampires as well as werewolves, as folklore, as metaphor, and as literary construct, and led indirectly to her radio play Vampirella and its short story adaptation, The Lady of the House of Love, which was the start of The Bloody Chamber. To begin with, Angela was unsure about what to call the play and the story. Scarlet Ceremony, House of Pleasure, House of Pain, Satanic Rhapsody were all possibilities. And then she wrote, horror comic supervillain, sorry, these are all Nosferatu. Couldn't resist, anyway, never mind. Horror comic heroine, Vampirella. Vampirella, she later explained in New Society, the chunky-thighed, horror-y superheroine and her scarlet garment cut to conceal her nipples while open at the navel. And from then on, that became the title of her radio play. Angela then, in her journal, wrote what she called an image cluster. It was her way of, in her work in progress notebook, she did what she called image clusters, visual images in a sort of cluster, which were like a sort of mood board for the stories that were to come. The starting point for the dense, compacted language of her stories, with someone has written blood and brains in the same sentence. She wrote, the anguish of a sterile, lonely soul, troubled with diseased imaginings. Claws and teeth are sharpened on centuries of corpses. Disastrous meteors heralded my path originally. Woman who can remove her eyes. Lapidary fingers, the wind always blows cold over graveyards. And eventually the opening of the play and its cast of characters began to take shape. Can a bird sing only the song he knows, or can he learn a new song? Sad, lonely lady vampire in a castle, the sleeping beauty, the lady of the house of love. Can a bird sing only the song he knows, or can he learn a new song, said the lovely, lonely lady vampire, whose hair fell down like tears as she rattled with a gold propelling pencil the bars of the cage in which her pet canary lived. Later, as you can see the sentence developing in the notebook, it's extraordinary. You start off with this image, you start off with a viewing of Nosferatu, you then go to this cluster of images, rather random images, and slowly the sentence, this highly crafted sentence emerges. Later, the propelling pencil would become a long fingernail, the bird would become it rather than he, and the canary would become just a bird. But Angela's first radio play, the starting point of the Bloody Chamber, would always begin with the sound of something sharp rattling against the bars of a cage. And next, Edwardian, our hero on a bicycle tour of the Carpathians. Cast list, hero, Vampirella, wardress, peasants. At this stage, hero with a small h, soon he'd be given a big H. At precisely the same time, in 1974, I was planning a research trip to the Carpathian Mountains in Romania, in the footsteps of Jonathan Harker in the novel Dracula, for a chapter in my vampire book. Not on a bicycle, but in a hired car, a Dacia 13, or in English, a Renault 12, with a notebook and camera on the back seat. As both play and story evolved, the hero became a dashing young chap out of Boy's Own Paper, Kirk in 1914, who goes on a cycling tour of the land beyond the forest. He's rather naive and overly enthusiastic. He studied the good old English tradition of literature at university. He looks as though he has the head of a lion and still believes that demons can be redeemed with a kiss. And he also believes that words are facts, which is always a mistake in Angela's fiction. Hero has all sorts of erotic adventures in the Carpathians, which was a nice thought. At least he almost does. when confronted by the cloistered vampire countess in her dark glasses in her glittering castle, the strapping hero tries to reassure himself by clinging to the world of facts. He says, "Soon it will be morning. The crowing of the mundane cock and the first light will dissolve this Gothic dream with the solvent of the naturals. Yes, perhaps I shall take her to Vienna, and we shall tip off her fingernails and take her to a good dentist, deal with her fangs. Perhaps one day when she is cured, Mother, I would like you to meet. There are some things that even if they are true, we must not believe them." And in the end, what protects hero from the countess is not traditional weapons of religion, holy water and the crucifix, or even of folklore, garlic and a wooden stake, but the fact that he's been brought up to repress his imagination, and he simply doesn't recognise a bloodsucker when she's staring him in the face. Desire is best coped with by blessing, quote, "the cold showers of my celibacy. Countess, keep your talents to yourself." He hopes to cure her by the innocence of his kiss, like in The Sleeping Beauty or The Flying Dutchman. And then, in the story version, off he goes to France to die, this being 1914, in a war that turns out to be more ghastly than any of his superstitious imaginings. Next day, as the story briskly concludes, the regiment embarked for France. I can remember talking to Angela about the effects of the First World War on the land of Nosferatu, which at the beginning of the war was at the outer edge of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In the play, the shadow of the fatal count rises over every bloody battlefield. And also, we talked about a coinage that we worked out together, hematodipsomania, my word for the pathological thirst for blood, like alcoholism, only much, much worse, where the drink must always be served at body temperature. I once said to her, just after my return from Transylvania, I couldn't understand a word they were saying, a line that went straight into the play in the mouth of the hero. And more generally, we discussed the vampire as dominance, dependence, and whether human relationships are sometimes simply about asset stripping. This became the gloomy line in her play. The shadow of the fatal count falls across every marriage bed. It's a very, very sacred thought. Here are some pictures I took, which I shared with Angela when we got back. Wandering around the Carpathians. This is Bran Castle, which isn't actually a castle in Dracula, but it's marketed as such by the Romanian Tourist Authority. Hero combats such dark thoughts by concentrating on his bicycle. Brackets, owl hoots, long lonely sound, the bicycle wheels wobble, click against stone. Hero. To ride a bicycle is in itself some protection against superstitious fears, since the bicycle is the product of pure reason applied to motion. Geometry at the service of man. Give me 2 spears in a straight line, and I will show you how far I can take them. Voltaire himself might have invented the bicycle, since it contributes so much to man's well-being, and nothing at all to his bane. Bicycling is beneficial to the health. The bicycle emits no harmful fumes and permits only the most decorous of speeds. It is not a murderous implement. Yet, like all the products of enlightened reason, the bicycle has a faint air of eccentricity about it. On 2 wheels in the land of the vampires, a suitable furlough for a member of the English middle class. And now we approach a rustic bridge. The wheels rattle. Something atavistic, something numinous about crossing whirling dark water by no moonlight. Count very softly, and when he crossed the bridge, the phantoms came to greet him. Now, Angela was kind enough to ask Liz Calder, her editor at Victor Gollancz, who were publishing her in the 70s, to read my book, The Vampire Lord Rutland to Count Dracula. And it was published on the same day as Angela's The Passion of New Eve, in a new series that Gollancz brought out called Gollancz Fantasy and Macabre, which was later to include The Bloody Chamber. This was April 1976. The problem in 1976 was that the salespeople and librarians thought of Gollancz books as yellow-jacketed rather than in spooky black and red, or even in spooky yellow and black. So the books weren't distributed as widely as they might have been. Angela wrote to me on publication day, "Congratulations, me old fruit, and here's to the next time. Lots of love." She also wrote, following a spiky review, "Don't fret over the Guardian review. The reviewer is a well-known loony who howls and bleeds when the mood is full. Lots of love. The only time we actually appeared in a story together was published in 1977, and this doesn't appear in any of Angela's bibliographers. It was a book called The Necronomicon. It was published by a Bristol-based H.G. Wells buff called George Hill. And, no, it wasn't George Hill, sorry, it comes to me. But anyway, it was a series of essays about H.P. Lovecraft, the American writer, who Angela liked a lot, despite his terrible attitudes to race and other things. And she wrote an article on Lovecraft and landscape in this book, and I wrote one called Dreams of Dead Names. And it came out as a book called The Necronomicon, with the two of us and others included in it. And for some reason, in none of the bibliographies, it's as if H.P. Lovecraft is below the visual threshold that people are prepared to go, even now. And so it doesn't count. In one of the earliest drafts of her vampire play, Angela wrote of the opening Cage of Blackbirds and Clockwork Toys. And she was absolutely fascinated by another kind of transformation. Puppets, toy theatres, Punch and Judy, China dolls, of which she kept a couple on her shelf in Hay Hill, near the little Craven A poster of a black cat, shams, copies, masks, fancy dress, and automata, the construction of identity. She'd already written the short story The Loves of Lady Purple, about an Asiatic professor and his automaton, Lady Purple, the Venus of the Orient. And partly, I think her fascination had to do with the artificial. Beneath the mannequin masks of femininity, were there yet more masks? And what then, she wonders? Was the appearance of femininity, in fact, part of its essence, or was it another form of mimicry? And if you look at the publications of Angela from the 60s onwards, the different images on the covers of her books are very interesting, from young anarchist in wire glasses, which was the Bristol phase, anorak and short hair, to romantic pre-Raphaelite with sidelong glance in the 1970s, to public intellectual with deliberately grey hair when the red dye stopped. All were a succession of masks of different people. Which was the real her? What did the masks say about her? And her fascination with artificial people was partly about puppet masters and puppets as well, as an image of patriarchal society, although she wouldn't have put it that way. Another favourite line at the time, often quoted, was from the social philosopher Theodor Adorno. The feminine character and the idea of femininity on which it is modelled are products of masculine society. And I remember we used to talk about those 18th century thinkers who were trying to prove that we were just soft machines. That Lamettrie and others, he wrote a book called L'Homme Machine, which basically says we're meat puppets, we're soft machines, there's nothing more to us, and that the supreme being simply winds us up like clockwork, and we behave like an automaton. And whilst I was researching Rousseau, and I remember sharing this with Angela, in Neuchâtel, in the Bibliothèque de l'Hôtel de Ville, there are a collection of automata by the Jacques-Droz brothers, who were watchmakers in the 1760s and 1770s. And one of them is a scribe, and one of them is a harpsichord player, and one is a draftsman. And they are absolutely extraordinary. Mechanical, of course, rather than digital. And if you're very nice to the technician, he winds them up for you. And he wound up the scribe for me. And the desk actually moves as he writes in 18th century copperplate. There's his back. And he writes this: I think, therefore I am, which is a fantastic 18th century joke about artificial intelligence. And he's been doing it since the 1770s. And the harpsichord player plays this extraordinary piece on the harpsichord, and the bellows are in her chest, so she breathes. Very creepy, very creepy. As she plays this piece, that's her hand. And when I was there, she suddenly started playing lots of bad notes. And the technician turned to me and said, I think she's tired. Anyway, automata. In April 1975, I went with Angela to the Henry Fuseli exhibition at the Royal Academy. And she stood for ages in front of the Midsummer Night's Dream paintings with their libidinous fairies and superheroic Oberon and Titania. while I pondered the visual connections between the nightmare, with its strange squat figure of a man sitting on a woman's chest and staring out at the viewer, and the design of Nosferatu. A seed was planted. Many years later, I co-curated an exhibition all about Gothic nightmares at Tate Britain, which some of you may have seen, centred on Fuseli's infamous painting. I didn't accompany Angela to the exhibition The Late Richard Dadd at the Tate in autumn 1974, but we went separately and discussed it. Dadd's paranoid painting of 1855, The Fairy Fellow's Masterstroke, made while he was in a lunatic asylum for killing his father in a fit of madness, and showing in obsessive tiny detail a fairy splitting a large chestnut for use as Queen Mag's chariot. And for me, this was a bizarre parody in miniature of the pre-Raphaelite painter Ford Madox Brown's huge painting Work, showing an idealised road gang at work in Hampstead. Angela was working on her radio play about Dadd. It was called Come Unto These Yellow Sands, and it was broadcast in March 1979, towards the end of her regular visits to Bath. And it's a fascinating radio play because it includes, in the form of monologues and lectures and witness statements, all sorts of discussions about fairies and fairy tales and what commentators have made of them. The child psychologist Bruno Bettelheim's Freudian book, The Uses of Enchantment, about how such tales help children at early stages in almost therapeutic ways to adjust to the realities of adolescent life, was published in 1976, and Angela devoured it, especially the chapters on Little Red Riding Hood, Bluebeard, and Beauty and the Beast. One of Bettelheim's conclusions was, with the tale's emphasis on the hero and on happily ever after, we are, quote, left in the dark about the feelings of the heroine. Angela was shortly to do something about that by foregrounding the adolescent sexuality latent in the stories, latent from background to foreground. Bettelheim also contrasted the bourgeois ornate style of Perrault in France, aware of his courtly audience, with the more down-to-earth approach of the Brothers Grimm, fusing the natural world with the uncanny fused with people who work with animals. Angela actually saw Perrault as more direct, much more aware of all the dressing up, and saw that his version of the fairy tales is about fairy tales, which is why she translated them. But she had serious doubts about the overall thesis of Bettelheim's book. For her, fairy tales weren't enough adjusting to the adult world. They were more transgressive, less conformist, and could actually be used to subvert the male view of sex and power, which is almost the opposite of what Bettelheim said they were for. About Red Riding Hood, Bettelheim wrote that the tale's basic elements were, quote, a little girl with a red cap and the company of wolves. And I'm absolutely certain that's where Angela found the title of her radio play, story, and subsequent film. The idea of putting a werewolf back into Little Red Riding Hood, where she originally belonged. In general, she loved Once Upon a Time, but was very uncomfortable with Happily Ever After. She was also uncomfortable with Bettelheim's tendency to see the meaning of these fairy tales as eternal or fixed for all time, rather than historically located and specific. For Angela, the tales changed their meaning with changing historical contexts. Susanna Clapp, in her recent book, A Card from Angela Carter, writes well about Angela's conversational style. Quote, her own tones were unmistakable, piping, soft, with clipped vowels. At times, Angela sounded like a parody of girlish gentility. At other times, she skidded into casual South London. You never knew exactly where you were. She was impossible to second guess. She was a great cursor and took pride in this. I am known in my circle as notoriously foul-mouthed, she said. I went to many dinner parties where she caused a sensation by saying absolutely outrageous things. Yet she was also a Byzantinely courteous. Her almost full-blooded protests would often be heralded by a disarming, forgive me, but, and then she'd say something. Susanna also writes about how she laughed or chuckled often and loudly, and how with her accuracy paraded itself as irony, and nonetheless ironic for that. If she sensed too much niceness around her, it could be wicked. She enjoyed sending me Donald McGill type cards like this, Enough said on the back, which is very sweet. When she first moved to London, this is South London, #1, Rat in Vegas, Phantom. I mean, a very Gothic exchange of postcards, which I have quite a lot. But my favourite letter from her was written when Angela first arrived in Sheffield on her creative writing fellowship. It was the first day of term, October 1976, and she was experiencing problems of adjustment. And it was here, as I've said, that the first 3 stories and her notes for the others, for the Bloody Chamber, turned into the book. And this is Sir Angela's letter. Dear Chris, forgive me for quoting it. The winds are wuthering around the Arts Tower, in which I sit in anomic reverie, contemplating a very aged typewriter and a 2-hour trip back to the commune, where my friends will be hard at work on the next edition of the Sheffield Free Press. I've just retrieved from the excellent, and I should hope so, library, a book called Wolves and Werewolves, which reminded me of you. Oh, well, you know what I mean. The first chapter is titled The Wolf That Ate the Postman. I shall take copious notes and transmit them to you. I may try to cross a werewolf with La Belle et la Bête, which is precisely what she did. Further, there is a course here onto which I've insinuated myself called the Gothic Imagination. And the reading list comprises everything from Melmoth the Wanderer to Bram Stoker, and now, I'm happy to say, also includes A. Carter. A showing of Nosferatu, too. The man responsible was very excited to hear I knew an authority on vampires, and even more excited to hear you are on third authority on Leone, since he's a Clint Eastwood buff and possibly a consenting adult, but don't worry, I will protect you. Anyway, I said you might be willing to do a turn, and he bounced and squeaked at the notion. So let me know when you're dropping by. I keep thinking that's 2 days done, only another 3 terms of 8 weeks minus 2 days. I'm sure this is the wrong reaction. Lots of love. And Terry Pratchett put this very well. He was a great fan of Angela's work, and in the Weird Sisters, for example, 1988. But he once wisely observed, she had a way of looking which made you feel whatever you were going to say next, it better be interesting. Angela was allergic to cliches and cliche behaviour. So, how does my friendship with Angela in Bath in the mid-70s mesh with the writings of academics and critics, now that her work has become acknowledged as one of the key British writers of the late 20th century? First of all, as I said earlier, I think she has been made into too much of a pastor saint, which she would have detested. And at the same time, she's been fitted too snugly into a box-marked feminism. As Marina Warner recently observed, she was much more independent-minded than the traditional feminists of her time, and she hated belonging. Her written dialogues were more often across time with literature, with cinema, with folklore, and with folk music, rather than with feminist critics of the day. Because she was usually so clever at embedding her theory and philosophy, and she read a great deal of it, she loved ideas. Because she embedded them in her fictional descriptions, she's given commentators a lot to chew on, and sometimes the theory has squeezed out, in my view, the sheer pleasure of the text, the sensual and visual pleasure, and the comedy. As Angela wrote, readers could take her books, quote, on as many levels as you can cope with at the time, and they should be read on your own terms. Too often, she'd been remade in the image of today's lines in haute culture, which weren't around in her day. Her view that culture was one long continuum, high, low, who cares, has not always fitted the more condescending attitude of her English literature interpreters. For example, in one analysis of Angela that's been written by a literary critic, it says she took a series of literary subgenres, science fiction, Gothic, fantasy, pornography, and, quote, turned their grubby stereotypes into sophisticated mythology. That phrase, grubby stereotypes, would not have appealed to Angela at all. She enjoyed these things for their own sake as well as for their implications. I'm not for anything that flickers, she once said, of her enthusiasm of going to the pictures. And she also said, I like to snipe from the sidelines. I like to snipe from where I get attacked a lot. And, quote, de Sade was a somewhat chaotic chap, and so, damn it, am I. But above all, I think that commentators on the writings of Angela Carter have tended to downplay a strong streak of socialism, a word that postmodernists dare not utter, if it isn't in quotation marks. She could be very solemn about it, too, another forbidden word. She once reminisced that her political formation grew partly from her childhood in South Yorkshire and its coalfields during the war, and partly from conversations with her anarchist friends in Bristol that she'd meet in the Bartley Cafe opposite the university. She was to write of fairy tales, folk tales, stories from the oral tradition, are all of them the most vital connection we have with the imaginations of ordinary men and women whose labour created our world. This also connected with her background, with her then husband Paul Carter, in the Bristol folk music scene in the 1960s, where she helped to make recordings. She knew Shirley Collins, she visited folk clubs, and had a good folk singing voice herself. In fact, books which have recently been written about this, or is it about to be published? I can't remember. Has it come out yet? Very soon, yeah. She read studies of popular ballads, especially Celtic ones, and their connections with archetypal stories. She loved ballads that dealt with wolves who were hairy on the inside. For some reason, the phrase, "and the larks they sang melodious," always reduced her to a fit of giggles. She liked her socialism to be full-blooded. She preferred Danton to Robespierre, Trotsky to Lenin, Joe Gormley to Arthur Scargill in the miners' strike, and she later reminded several interviewers, if they went on about her status as a New Age role model and what did she feel about being a latter-day Mother Goose, she said, "Look, I'm a socialist, damn it. How can you expect me to be interested in fairies?" Or, "This world is all there is, and in order to question the nature of reality, one must move from a strongly grounded base to what constitutes material reality. I'm in the demythologizing business." When I was reading Angela's diaries and journals in preparation for the book and this talk, actually, the most emotional moment I had was when I came across in her big red diary for 1974, of course, a listing of the bus times from the city centre to the University of Bath and back again. Because in 1974, Angela would sometimes come and sit at the back of my lectures at the university on political theory or Soviet cinema or the history of European thought out of sheer personal interest. And in those days, she'd smoke her way through the lecture and then leave. Ex-students of mine who sat near her have recently let me know that this happened much more often than I remembered. It must have been one of the reasons she noted the bus times. Shortly before she moved from Bath, she presented me with this collage, cut out paper on thick cardboard, based on the colours of a well-known brand of sweets. It was called, she explained, "It takes all sorts to make a world." I think it's a very suitable punchline, not just for this lecture, but for the whole day. Suitable thought to end this symposium on the Gothic in Bath. It takes all sorts to make a world. Thank you very much.
Absolutely wonderful, and I feel I have a better appreciation of Angela and Peter as well. So thank you very much.
There should be a plaque in Hay Hill.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks.
I have one slide, but there's much to do. So if anybody else would like to help, that's great. I don't know if we have time for questions.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
You'd like one. Okay, well, Marie has one. It was fun.
And I've been doing some research. Wondered whether she was influenced, that she came to Bath by a book that's in her library called The Flying King of Bath. And it's an ancient king called King Blackwell, and he has wings made out of feathers, and he flies, I forget from where he starts, but he flies to London, which is another connection with the Cockney feathers in her novel, and he crash lands. And she had a copy of this book in her library. It's published the year she moved to Bath by a local publisher in Bath. And I just wondered if she ever mentioned that.
No, she didn't, but that's very, very interesting. This was a book.
And the audience came
yeah,
here.
Gotcha. It's a book published about King Bladud growing wings. Is that right? A local history book. Right, and it was in her library collection. I don't know about that, but I do know she wrote a performance piece for a big performance at Walcott in about 74, 75 called Transformations. which was all about evolution in reverse. It had a performance artist from South America who had huge wings, and he removed them and became more and more human. It was a kind of reverse of evolution as the extraordinary drumming continued. And he only had one piece of dialogue in the whole thing. He came to the front when he was completely naked and said, "Big bird." That was it. And we all went home. It was the 70s. And so she was clearly fascinated by people putting on and taking off feathers. Yes, that was in Walcott where they had the arts workshop. And it was, they had about 8 drummers. It was absolutely deafening. And this character taking off his wings and taking off all his clothes and saying "Big bird." And it was about 20 minutes long. It was longish for the idea. But so it was obviously on her mind. You know, I don't know about the Blader book, no.
Right, and I'm happy to report that my bookshop, Camden Books, was at the Bath Arts Workshop at 146 Walcott Street for 25 years. And I hadn't realized at the time that Angela had been there and had put on these plays until I started doing that. One other question, and then,
Hear about Angela's involvement with the Lake Department.
Yes. Although she lived in Hay Hill, she used to come to the meetings of the Bathwick branch of the Labour Party, which was a select few, as you can imagine. And she was the political education officer. So the one thing we achieved was we put together in 1976, for the 50th anniversary of the general strike, we put together a slide tape music performance, which was shown at Bath Labour Party in Manvers Street in those days. And it was slides in the general strike with music from 1920, the Black Bottom and things like that, in 1926. And Angela and Edward, her friend, and me reading poems from the Penguin Book of Socialist Verse, William Morris, Brecht, all sorts of things like that. So it didn't engage with political events of the day, but we had a wonderful time doing sort of theatrical things, and which, with Angela as political education officer, is what you might expect. But no, it was interesting. I remember she didn't do this, but one of the baptism, when you joined the Bath Labour Party in those days, you had a baptism of fire, which was to canvass Royal Crescent. And of course, the houses were already beginning to be broken up into apartments, so people didn't have to come and speak to you to say bugger off. They said it down the intercom. And so I was having a terrible time. I was saying, go away, and mum said, oh, they weren't in. And then I pressed the buzzer, and a window came up on the top floor of one of the houses in Royal Crescent. And this elderly lady leant out and said, "It's all right by me, brother." Shh. I thought that's the nearest I've got to a convert, but I'm afraid she wasn't going to get out and vote. But yes, no, that was the. But no, the socialism. I was quite serious about that. I mean, if you read her New Society pieces, there's the degree zero. The bottom line is quite an old-fashioned kind of socialism about sort of Ken Loach style. I mean, class war, etc. And that comes through in the Bloody Chamber as well. A lot of her asides, and I do think that's not been emphasised enough in commentary. She tended to be treated as an aesthete, and I think it's more grounded than that in politics. But that's just my memory of her, really. But yes, no, political education officer of the Bathwick branch. She didn't belong to the Hay Hill branch. Maybe there wasn't one. I don't know. Yeah. There was a lady in the bus. Sorry, just one more. Is it? Yeah. Can you do one more? Yeah.
You have
That's a very interesting question. I don't think so. I think she was fascinated by transformations and by, as I've said, by our relationship with animals and what that tells us about ourselves and our psychology, both physically and psychologically. She was fascinated by our relationship with animals, and she was fascinated by metamorphoses and transformations. But her sexual politics was very 1970s. And a lot of the things that are, quite rightly, of concern of people since aren't central to what she's... You may be right. There may be a lesbian sort of feeling in that. But I'm not sure she was foregrounding that. She was... there's something... in terms of sexual politics, she's almost a little bit old-fashioned in some respects, I think. Although Marie may disagree because she's dug deeper into this question. But it's a very vexed question, that, really, because everyone wants to like her very much, but there's a kind of blind spot, they feel. And I tend to agree with that. I mean, Margaret Atwood wrote about this in her introduction to The Bloody Chamber. She did an edition of it, saying she's not sure what's going on from the point of view of sexual politics, but she likes to give Angela the benefit of the doubt. But I have my doubts. 72, 73, it wasn't in the ether. It just wasn't. Class was, the environment was beginning to be, animal rights were big at the early 70s, but that kind of sexual preference wasn't in quite the same way, I think. One has to contextualize her a bit. Yeah.
Right. Well, Christopher, it was wonderful to have you back at the institution again. I have arranged for a thank you speaker who had to be in Africa today. But luckily I have a director of the institution who's going to do the formal thank yous. But before he comes up totally, we have a competition in connection with the one-day symposium to ask you what was your favorite Gothic novel and why. And the winner was, I don't know if she's in the audience, Emily Laquesta. Are you here? Right. Your prize is 2 tickets to the Mary Shelley House of Frankenstein. So this is just a piece of paper. We'll get you the actual tickets later. Chris is in the back and he will arrange that with you. Okay. You're welcome. And I can say what the novel was, The Woman in White, right, by Wilkie Collins. All right, so the good novel to read. So Joe Houlihan.
Thanks, everyone, and what a wonderful day we've had. I hope you all agree. This institution was established almost exactly 200 years ago. It's our birthday bicentennial in 2 years' time. And it was established with the idea of spreading knowledge and sharing ideas. I'm sure you'll agree we certainly maintain that tradition today with some wonderful entertaining tours. So I'd like to start off by thanking our incredible list of speakers. Our day began with an exhilarating talk on the appeal of the Gothic by Robert Morrison. Robert gave us a historical overview of the Gothic, examining how different movements such as sentimentalism, the graveyard, school of poetry and the sublime fed into its birth, bringing from the literature of the past sensationalism, sense of the supernatural, and the portrayal of terror as the strongest of the human emotions. The theme of the novel, I think Robert explained, allowed for greater complexity in the expression of darker human emotion and provided a counterpoint to the realism of the 19th century novel. But the Gothic did not just externalise the emotions of the individual, and it was of great interest this morning to see how Desire, for example, thought Gothic as a political response to revolution in Europe at the time. And I think Robert also gave us a memorable metaphor for the distinction between terror and horror. Terror is a grizzly bear outside the door, horror is a grizzly bear inside the door. Then Dr. Amy Cross gave a talk on Gothic by William Beckford, looking at how Bedford, product of great family wealth built predominantly on slavery, used the language and tenets of Orientalism to build his own version of the Gothic. We saw how he went on the sublime and how, rather intriguingly, his 21st birthday party became sort of a myth that fed into that. And a great interest of people here in Bath, we saw how Fonthill didn't serve to inspire Gothic, but rather Gothic inspired Fonthill. Beckford's work using the architecture of the unknown in the record, using the architecture unknown in the records of the earth, quotation, that Gothic required. He brought that into his architecture this year in Bath at Bristol. Additionally, we saw how the architecture of the Gothic novel encompassed the horrors of colonialism, and obviously that was very close to home with Bedford himself. In his talk, Anne Radcliffe, pioneer of Gothic fiction, Andrew Smith, observed how Radcliffe absorbed three key political influences in the French Revolution, religion, and gender, to forge a cosmology that was orderly and organised by Providence. For this world, Radcliffe introduced the first element, which were the building bricks of her own type of female Gothic. Aristocrats took on middle-class characteristics, and a subtle feminism infused her writing and made her one of the most popular and highly paid novelists in that period. In Mary Shelley in Bath and the Shelleys in Somerset, Sheila Hannon from the Show of Strength Theatre Company took us on a mental tour of Bath and gave us some delightful insight into the Shelley's life within the city and its soap opera elements. We all know about Jane Austen's connections with Bath, but perhaps few of us were in the picture about Frankenstein having been written here in large part. Thanks to Sheila and the team of people who had a plaque for Shelley placed on the railings to pump rooms, many more people are in the picture now. And thanks to Betty for her participation and to Christopher indeed. Chris Harris from the Mary Shelley House of Frankenstein joined us and told us how that new attraction in Bath was created. It was fascinating to hear his insights and especially how it all came together during some very difficult times. I've been to the attraction and I can tell you it's really, really worth a visit because it really combines what you want for a family visit with the horror elements with really sound literary analysis of how it all came together and that whole circle around Shelley and Percy Shelley and Empire. Finally, Angela Carter once said, "I'm often putting new wine in old bottles. This is exactly what she did so brilliantly with the Gothic novel." During his talk, Inside the Bloody Chamber, Angela Carter in Bath, Sir Christopher Frayling allowed us to see inside her creative process and shone a light on how she took a subversive spirit for the Gothic novel and has made it entirely relevant again to new audiences ever since the 1960s. That Angela Carter and so many of these great writers lived in Bath is testament to the spirit of the city, and perhaps we'd like to think that their ghosts are walking with us now. And if there's another plaque still crying out to go up on the city walls alongside Mary Wollstonecraft, then surely it must be that of Angela Carter. An event like this, as you can imagine, takes a lot of organisation. And before we finish, I'd like to thank all the staff and volunteers who made it happen today, particularly John Law for organising the filming and looking after everything, Ellen Jones-Redman, Tony Symes, and Keely Herbert. And I'd especially like to thank Betty Suko for conceiving this event, putting together such a wonderful programme, attracting such excellent speakers and making it all happen. Thank you, Betty. And finally, of course, I'd like to thank everyone for attending, all of those of you who came here in person, and for everyone who's been viewing the events online. It just remains for me to say, enjoy the rest of the weekend, perhaps plunge into a Gothic novel as Halloween's approaching in a week's time. And thank you all very much.